In the summer of 301 BCE, on the arid plains of Phrygia in central Anatolia, the last men who personally knew Alexander the Great assembled to fight over his ghost. It was the Battle of Ipsus, a monumental clash where over 150,000 troops converged to decide whether a single king would once again rule the known world, or if the empire would be permanently fractured. As the massive armies marched into position, the tread of tens of thousands of infantrymen kicked up the choking dust of the Anatolian plains, destroying battlefield visibility and setting the stage for a historic disaster. This grand confrontation was meant to reunite an empire, but its outcome was dictated by a staggering military paradox. A prince who won his initial cavalry charge only to pursue a rooting enemy far beyond the battlefield, and a living blockade of 400 Indian war elephants that physically prevented his return. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we break down the tactical formations, the fatal command error, and the unprecedented elephant deployment at the Battle of Ipsus, the day Alexander's dream officially died. But to understand why an 81-year-old veteran king perished on the front lines, desperately waiting for a cavalry rescue that never came, we must first rewind 22 years to the sudden death of the Macedonian conqueror. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, without a capable heir, his vast empire did not simply shatter, it was deliberately dismantled from the inside out. For 22 grueling years, his former generals, known as the Diadochi, tore the map apart in a series of ruthless civil wars. By the turn of the century, the political landscape had settled into a fragile, multipolar reality, but one man refused to accept a divided world. Antigonus I Monophthalmus, the One-Eyed, controlled a massive, deeply wealthy power base stretching across the breadth of Asia Minor and the Levant. Now in his 80s, this hardened veteran possessed both the financial infrastructure and the singular terrifying ambition to crush his former brothers-in-arms and reunite the entire Macedonian Empire under his own dynastic banner. For the remaining warlords, stopping the Antigonid war machine was no longer a matter of securing border territories. It was an absolute, immediate necessity for their own survival. If the One-Eyed King was allowed to isolate and defeat them one by one, their newly minted kingdoms would be systematically erased. Driven by this cold, inescapable geopolitical logic, an unprecedented defensive coalition was forged. Cassander, ruling from the ancestral homeland of Macedonia, and Lysimachus, commanding the rugged terrain of Thrace, allied themselves with Seleucus I Nicator, the master of Babylon and the sprawling eastern territories. This alliance was not a partnership built on trust or loyalty, but a temporary pact of desperate pragmatism. To strike directly at the heart of Antigonid power, the coalition had to execute a logistical nightmare, mobilizing tens of thousands of regular troops and marching them across the fragmented Hellenistic world to converge on central Anatolia. Moving armies of this unprecedented scale required brutal discipline and highly synchronized supply lines. Endless grain convoys and heavy baggage trains labored to keep the Allied columns fed, navigating harsh weather and hostile frontiers to bring the fractured armies together on the plains of Phrygia. The strategic pressure was immense. A single failure in coordination meant facing the Antigonid forces piecemeal, virtually guaranteeing total annihilation. When the Allied lines finally linked up and deployed across the arid flatlands opposite Antigonus, the balance of power appeared precariously even. The coalition had the numbers to match the One-Eyed King, but Seleucus brought a weapon from the far edges of the map that Antigonus could never have anticipated. Commanding the Antigonid line was the One-Eyed King himself, alongside his brilliantly aggressive son, Demetrius Poliorcetes. Together, they fielded an astonishing 70,000 heavy and light infantry, flanked by 10,000 elite cavalry, armor and supported by a respectable vanguard of 75 war elephants. The operational core of their army, and indeed of all Hellenistic warfare, was the Macedonian-style Phalanx. This was a rigid, deeply layered infantry block where the first 5 ranks leveled 20-foot-long ash wood pikes, known as Sarissas, projecting an impenetrable, bristling wall of iron points. Screened by agile peltasts and archers, and anchored by heavy companion-style cavalry designed to deliver shattering shock charges, the Antigonid war machine was meticulously engineered to pin an opposing center before systematically rolling up its flanks. Opposite this imposing front, the combined forces of Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus deployed a slightly smaller infantry contingent of roughly 64,000 men, and alongside 10,500 cavalry and a brutal addition of 120 scythed chariots designed to sever limbs and break enemy cohesion. In a conventional engagement of the era, a numerical disadvantage in heavy infantry of this scale would heavily favor the seasoned Antigonus. However, the coalition's true center of gravity lay in the unprecedented strategic asset Seleucus had marched across the continent. A staggering 400 Indian war elephants. Seleucus had acquired this massive herd just a year prior through a landmark diplomatic settlement with the Mauryan Emperor Chandragupta, ceding vast tracts of his easternmost provinces in the Indus Valley in exchange for a living, breathing weapon system that would fundamentally alter the physical geometry of the battlefield. Within the established military doctrine of the successor states, war elephants were deployed as a highly volatile but essential forward screen. Positioned ahead of the main infantry lines, their primary tactical function was twofold: to physically crush enemy light skirmishers and to violently disrupt incoming cavalry formations. The supreme effectiveness of this animal screen relied on a harsh biological reality of ancient combat, as war horses would instinctively panic and violently refuse to charge when confronted by the immense bulk and the pungent, unfamiliar scent of the beasts. A deployment of 400 elephants did not just provide a screen. It represented an unbroken muscular barricade spanning the entirety of the coalition front. This absolute superiority in heavy beasts completely neutralized Antigonus's traditional tactical approaches, and creating an overwhelming psychological and physical barrier that forced his cavalry commanders to look for aggressive, high-risk solutions on the extreme flanks. With over 150,000 men deployed across the flat earth, the formations were locked. But in ancient warfare, the grandest plans rarely survive the first clash of the cavalry. The battlefield at Ipsus offered no natural topographical advantages, no protective hills to anchor a flank, no rivers to channel an enemy's advance. It was a remarkably flat, sun-baked expanse of Phrygian earth that dictated a brutally straightforward tactical geometry, a massive, unavoidable head-on collision. In the center, both supreme commanders deployed their immense Sarissa phalanxes, forming 2 parallel blocks of heavy infantry that stretched for miles across the plain. Forward of these main lines stood the light skirmishers and the respective elephant screens, positioned to absorb the initial shock of contact. On the extreme wings, the armies massed their striking power in the form of heavy cavalry. The crucial Antigonid right wing was assigned to Demetrius Poliorcetes, who organized his elite horsemen directly opposite the coalition's left flank, commanded by Seleucus's own heir, the young prince Antigonus. As the vanguard units initiated their forward march, the sheer scale of the operation transformed the physical environment from a passive stage into an active, debilitating force. It was the height of the Anatolian summer, and the ground was entirely devoid of moisture, when over 150,000 soldiers, tens of thousands of war horses, and nearly 500 multi-ton elephants moved in unison, their tread churned the parched topsoil into an impenetrable, towering cloud of dust. This was not a minor haze, It was a massive curtain of airborne earth that rapidly erased the horizon and blotted out the light. Within minutes of the first maneuvers, battlefield visibility completely collapsed. For commanders who relied entirely on line of sight to direct strategic reserves, relay orders, or assess the momentum of a flank attack, this environmental factor was instantly crippling. Once a unit was committed into that opaque void, it was effectively severed from the supreme command, operating blindly within its own narrow sector. Beneath this thick canopy of dust, the rigid blocks of the opposing phalanxes maintained their disciplined geometric advance. The sophisticated mechanics of Hellenistic infantry warfare were now moving forward on instinct and momentum, governed only by the muffled rhythm of the command drums and the shouting of the frontline officers. The distance between the armies evaporated rapidly as the infantry braced for the ultimate test of weight and endurance. As the Sarissas lowered and the lines closed, the battle's fate was handed over to the rashness of a single prince on the right flank. The engagement commenced not with a sudden shock, but with a lethal, calculated exchange of missiles. Forward of the advancing heavy infantry blocks, thousands of light skirmishers, archers, slingers, and peltists, armed with javelins, probed the opposing lines. Their objective was to harass the enemy approach, inflict early casualties, and disrupt the tight formations before the main collision. However, as the immense rigid walls of the Antigonid and coalition phalanxes bore down on each other, these lightly armored troops executed a rehearsed withdrawal, slipping back through the predetermined gaps in their own advancing ranks. With the screens cleared, the two largest heavy infantry formations of the ancient world were left with a completely unobstructed path to mutual destruction. The resulting collision was a masterpiece of lethal geometry and brutal physical compression. A Macedonian-style phalanx was not designed for individual combat. It was a collective engine of war. As the two sides met, the front five ranks of both armies leveled their 20-foot sarissas simultaneously, creating an interlaced thicket of iron points. The depth of the formation was its true weapon. Men in the rear ranks held their pikes angled upward to deflect incoming projectiles, while driving the weight of their bronze-faced shields directly into the backs of the men in front of them. This was the othismos, the literal push of the phalanx. Survival and victory in the center did not depend on swordsmanship, but on the relentless, forward-driving momentum and the absolute discipline of the block holding its shape under catastrophic pressure. As thousands of men pressed into the kill zone, the physical reality of the battle stripped away any remaining centralized control. The sensory anchor of this central meat grinder was purely auditory. The deafening, continuous splintering of thick ash wood pike shafts snapping under thousands of pounds of sheer compression, not overlaid with the relentless, metallic grinding of bronze shields locked edge to edge. Within this devastating crush, the noise level escalated into a physical barrier. Verbal orders from unit commanders were completely drowned out by the roar of the collision. The heavy infantry blocks were effectively deafened, operating entirely on ingrained drill, forward pressure, and the desperate instinct to maintain their footing. If a single rank buckled, the entire formation could rupture and collapse in seconds. For hours, the battle in the center devolved into a grinding, attritional equilibrium. Despite the massive numbers involved and the relentless expenditure of human life, neither the Antigonid veterans nor the hardened coalition infantry could achieve a decisive structural breakthrough. The Phrygian plain became an anvil where tens of thousands of men were locked in a slow, agonizing trial of endurance. The tactical reality was clear. The massive phalanxes could pin each other in place, but they could not quickly destroy one another without a flanking maneuver to shatter their cohesion from the sides. The center was holding, a bloody stalemate of bronze and ash. Yet, on the right wing, Demetrius saw an opening that would unravel the entire Antigonid Empire. While the infantry ground themselves into an agonizing stalemate, Demetrius Poliorcetes unleashed the full offensive power of the Antigonid right wing. Commanding a massive formation of elite, companion-style heavy cavalry, the prince initiated a devastating charge directly into the coalition left flank, commanded by Seleucus's son, Antiochus. The sheer kinetic weight of thousands of armored horsemen driving their heavy lances into the opposing lines proved catastrophic for the coalition vanguard. Unable to absorb the concentrated shock of the Antigonid assault, Antiochus's cavalry formations rapidly buckled, broke their defensive cohesion, and began a chaotic, disorganized retreat to avoid total annihilation. In the immediate, localized theater of the right wing, Demetrius had secured a textbook tactical breakthrough, executing exactly what was expected of a Hellenistic cavalry commander. However, this localized triumph instantly devolved into the most fatal strategic error of the entire war. Instead of halting his squadrons to wheel around and strike the exposed rear of the coalition infantry, the classic hammer and anvil maneuver that defined Macedonian military doctrine, Demetrius ordered a relentless, open-ended pursuit of the fleeing enemy. The psychology of ancient heavy cavalry made them notoriously difficult to rein in once the adrenaline of a successful breakthrough took hold. But a supreme commander's duty was to maintain operational discipline. Driven by the aggressive instinct to completely eradicate the retreating threat, and perhaps blinded by the pursuit of personal martial glory, Demetrius allowed his elite formations to gallop miles away from the primary engagement. This catastrophic lapse in command discipline was heavily compounded by the harsh environmental realities of the Phrygian battlefield. As Demetrius pushed his warhorses further out across the arid flatlands, the towering curtain of pulverized topsoil completely swallowed his regiments. Within minutes, the prince lost all visual contact with his father's central command, and the grueling infantry struggle still raging on the main line. By removing his 10,000 elite horsemen from the tactical equation, Demetrius fundamentally altered the structural architecture of the battle. He had voluntarily stripped the Antigonid Phalanx of its primary defensive screen and its most lethal offensive asset, trading a decisive advantage for a strategically meaningless chase. Demetrius chased glory into the blinding dust, leaving his 81-year-old father's flank completely exposed. Seleucus I Nicator, observing from the coalition center, did not miss the opportunity. He immediately recognized the fatal geometry of the shifting battlefield and the massive structural void that had opened on the right flank of the Antigonid line. He did not order a desperate infantry maneuver to exploit the gap. Instead, he executed one of the most decisive tactical deployments in ancient military history. Activating his unprecedented reserve of over 300 Indian war elephants, Seleucus directed them to march directly into the corridor Demetrius had just abandoned. Crucially, this was not an aggressive charge aimed at shattering infantry lines. Seleucus deployed the massive beasts as an impassable living barricade, extending his line at a sharp angle to completely sever the Antigonid center from its wayward heavy cavalry. Miles away from the main engagement, the adrenaline of the initial breakthrough finally faded, and Demetrius realized the catastrophic nature of his overextension. Halting his 10,000 elite horsemen, the prince wheeled his exhausted squadrons around and ordered a desperate gallop back toward the Phrygian plain to salvage the crumbling Antigonid flank. But as the heavy cavalry emerged from the blinding dust clouds, they didn't find an exposed enemy rear waiting to be broken. Instead, they crashed into a literal wall of beasts. Hundreds of fully grown elephants, flanked by highly mobile light infantry and archers, stood shoulder to shoulder across the entire breadth of the return route. The biological reality of ancient warfare abruptly halted the Antigonid counter-assault. A heavy cavalry charge relied entirely on the unyielding momentum of the warhorse, but equine psychology is rigidly governed by survival instinct. Confronted by the towering silhouettes and, most importantly, The alien, overwhelming scent of the massive animals. Now the Antigonid horses panicked. No amount of spurring, whipping, or command discipline could force the mounts to drive their chests into the tusked blockade. The cavalry squadrons reared, broke formation, and violently refused to close the distance, completely neutralizing their kinetic power. Seleucus had brilliantly weaponized the instinctual limitations of the enemy's mounts, turning his elephants into a static fortress rather than a battering ram. By neutralizing the right wing without committing a single heavy infantryman, Seleucus fundamentally altered the structural integrity of the battle. The Antigonid phalanx, still locked in the grueling, forward-driving push of pikes in the center, was now entirely isolated. Without cavalry to protect its vulnerable sides and rear, the massive, rigid block of 70,000 men transitioned from an unstoppable offensive engine into a static, trapped target. The coalition commanders systematically repositioned their light troops, pouring thousands of skirmishers into the secured flanks to dismantle the veteran infantry. Demetrius was entirely powerless to intervene. Trapped behind a wall of tusk and muscle, Demetrius could only listen to the distant roar as the coalition forces closed in around his father. Without its cavalry screen, the massive Antigonid phalanx was instantly transformed from a world-conquering offensive engine into a doomed, static formation. A Macedonian-style heavy infantry block was virtually invincible from a frontal assault, but it was structurally incapable of rapid redeployment to defend its sides or rear. Exploiting this fatal vulnerability, the coalition commanders systematically directed thousands of light cavalry and peltists into the unprotected flanks. An unrelenting crossfire of javelins, slingstones, and arrows began to dismantle the Antigonid lines from the outside in. Unable to pivot their cumbersome 20-foot sarissas to face these highly mobile attackers, the veteran infantrymen were pinned in place, absorbing punishing casualties without any means of retaliation. As the physical cohesion of the phalanx disintegrated under the flanking fire, the psychological breaking point of the army was rapidly breached. Hellenistic military engagements were deeply pragmatic, and veteran mercenaries recognized immediately when a tactical position became mathematically unsalvageable. Rather than face certain slaughter, massive contingents of the Antigonid infantry, some of the most experienced heavy foot soldiers in the ancient world, chose survival over loyalty. Thousands of men broke formation, lowered their pikes, and actively surrendered or defected to the coalition forces mid-battle. The once impenetrable center of the One-Eyed King's empire was literally dissolving on the plains, leaving his royal command group increasingly isolated amidst the collapsing front. Despite the catastrophic disintegration of his army, 81-year-old Antigonus Monophthalmus flatly refused to order a retreat, operating under the desperate assumption that his son had simply been delayed by a stubborn pursuit. The supreme commander maintained his forward position, surrounded by his elite foot guards. Antigonus repeatedly assured his remaining officers that Demetrius would break through the enemy lines and deliver the crushing rear charge that their strategy demanded. But the cavalry rescue never materialized. Instead, a massive wave of coalition peltasts closed the final distance to the royal vanguard. Antigonus, the last great contemporary of Alexander, who still possessed the power to unite the empire, was not struck down in a cinematic melee. He was simply overwhelmed by a concentrated, devastating volley of javelins, his unyielding faith in a ruined tactical plan finally costing him his life. When the One-Eyed King fell to the Phrygian dust, the battle ended. But the shockwaves of his death would permanently redraw the map of the world. While the lifeless body of Antigonus Monophthalmus was stripped of its royal armor on the plain, his son Demetrius managed to extricate himself from the tactical disaster. Fleeing toward the coast with a meager fraction of his once elite cavalry, Demetrius left behind the ruins of his father's supreme ambition. With the One-Eyed King dead and his grand army shattered, the massive Antigonid Empire in Asia instantly ceased to exist as a unified entity. The victorious coalition commanders, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, wasted no time in ruthlessly carving up the spoils of their triumph. Lysimachus expanded his Thracian domain deep into Asia Minor, absorbing its wealthy coastal cities, while Seleucus claimed the vast, lucrative territories of Syria and northern Mesopotamia. This pragmatic partition did not just redraw territorial borders, it permanently extinguished the defining political ideology of the era. The concept of a single, omnipotent successor inheriting the entirety of Alexander the Great's dominion was officially buried at Ipsus. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, a new geopolitical reality solidified across the Eastern Mediterranean, the multipolar Hellenistic state system. Instead of a universal, monolithic empire spanning from Greece to India, the map was now dominated by heavily militarized, fiercely competitive regional powers that would spend the next 2 centuries locked in a precarious, shifting balance of power. The supreme irony of the Wars of the Diadochi was finally realized in the dust of central Anatolia. Alexander's generals had fought with such desperate, unyielding ferocity to claim his throne that they had fractured it into jagged pieces, creating a permanently divided world that none of them possessed the structural strength to put back together. This permanent geopolitical division carried a profound, delayed consequence for the entire trajectory of Western history. By exhausting their manpower, squandering their wealth, and cementing a fractured political landscape, the successor states inadvertently engineered their own eventual destruction. Centuries later, a rising, highly disciplined republic on the Italian peninsula would look eastward and find not a unified Macedonian behemoth, but a disjointed network of rival kingdoms that could be systematically isolated, manipulated, and conquered. The Battle of Ipsus ensured that when the Roman legions finally marched into Greece and Asia, they would devour the Hellenistic world piece by piece. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.